Uh, I think I understood your question. You wanted me to give you some on my background.
A little bit on your background and a little bit on your Earth climate theory.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm a mechanical engineer and I focused on thermal fluids, which is things like fluid mechanics and thermodynamics and heat transfer. So while I don't actually generate climate science, I can understand a lot of it, and I work with people like Dr. Ball to help the public understand what climate scientists are really saying. And it's obviously very different to what you hear in a lot of the media. We were formed, the International Climate Science Coalition was formed in 2007 by the New Zealand Climate Science Coalition because they were so popular internationally with their nonpartisan science-based approach that they wanted a group to represent them internationally at conferences and things like that. So they started the International Climate Science Coalition in 2007, and they hired me in 2008. I've been executive director, chief cook and bottle washer, so to speak, ever since. We have a group of about 25 advisors who are highly qualified people like Dr. Ball, and I work with them to try to get good science out to the public.
Now, let's take a look at the Earth. They claim it has never been this warm. We're all gonna burn to death. The climate's horrible. The truth is, there's multiple times in the Earth's history that the Earth has been this warm or warmer, and that the Earth started warming 15, 18,000 years ago from the last ice age. How do those? How does that data matter to the average person, particularly the average person who's being bullied and intimidated by a tree hugger?
Yeah, well, I think the thing they should point out is that, the Holocene optimum, which was, in the neighborhood of 8,000 years ago, plus or minus a few thousand years, that was the warmest period since the end of the last glacial, when, where I'm sitting right now here in Canada, there was 2 kilometers of ice over our head. So, I mean, that is real climate change,
How did the
going.
American energy industry manage to destroy that much glacier ice so quickly? That's horrible. Does General Motors realize the crimes they've committed?
Yeah, well, 8,000 years ago, when there was a lot more ice, it was melting, of course, quickly. As I say, the Holocene optimum was warmer than today, as was the Roman warm period, the Minoan warm period, and the medieval warm period around 1000 AD. But, it's interesting, Tim, 8,000 years ago, sea level was rising 10 times faster than today. Okay, long before humans were doing very much from the point of view of civilization. And it is interesting that since the year 2000, we've seen virtually a stabilization of temperature, even though CO2 continues to rise, mostly because of the industrialization of China, which now puts out more than twice as well, about twice as much emissions as the United States. And of course, they're not held to any limits under the Paris Agreement. They say they can increase all the way to 2030, but of course we're supposed to start reducing immediately. But Tim, underlying the Paris Agreement on climate change is a treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it essentially gives developing countries, and they include China in that list, it gives developing countries an out clause. And the out clause is that Article 4 in the base treaty that underlies all of the UN climate treaties says that the first and overriding priority for developing countries is poverty alleviation and development. Okay? It doesn't say climate change. So do you think they're going to turn off their cheapest form of power, which is coal-fired power, if their primary objective is development? The answer is obviously no. So I think that even when we get to 2030, China is going to continue to increase their emissions, and they're going to say, well, we have an out clause. We don't have to if it's going to interfere with our development. And obviously it would if they turned off their cheapest form of power.
Well, see, there are no poor people in America. Everybody in the United States is wealthy, so yeah, we should probably be taxed and be penalized so heavily. And the Chinese, they have nothing. I mean, the Chinese have no energy. They have no money. I feel so sorry for those guys.
Yeah, the trouble is, what's going to happen if this sort of thing continues with, say, a Democratic president, if that's what happens next, is more and more industries will simply move to China because they don't, they can forget about their greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, their pollution standards are not like ours either. So the net result of these treaties could very well be that the Earth is inundated with a lot more greenhouse gases. But as Tim Ball was undoubtedly explaining, it really doesn't matter. The carbon dioxide emitted by us is only a good thing. It's only a good thing because, in the last few decades, we've seen a great increase in crop yield, largely because of the CO2 rise. And if you think about it, Dr. Ball, for example, he points out that plants, generally speaking, evolved at a time when there was a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. Plants love it at 1,200 parts per million. Right now, it's about 405. So that's why we pump 1,200 parts per million typically into greenhouses, and we get a lot more crop yield. And of course, those crops grow with less water too. So as CO2 rises, we're going to see a lot of benefit. Parts of the world that currently cannot grow plants will eventually be able to. So the last thing we should do is restrict CO2 emissions.
What was the Earth's CO2 level, say at the time of the dinosaurs, when you think of this big, beautiful green Earth and an open Arctic Circle with no ice? What was the CO2 levels?
I'm not sure exactly. At 440 million years ago, that was about the peak of CO2 in the geologic record. And at that time, it was about 11 times today's level. That's 1,100% of today. They talk about a 40% rise since 1880 as being catastrophic. Well, no, we're at one of the lowest levels of CO2 in Earth's history. In fact, we're much closer to a low level at which plants start to die, which is typically around 150 parts per million, than we are to any dangerous upper limit. Now, the interesting thing, Tim, is that at times when CO2 was very high, like at 440 million years ago, the Earth was in fact very cold. That was actually the coldest period in this time frame as well. Other times when CO2 was high, the temperature was high. Other times it was in the middle. Geologists, who are the people who are usually excluded from the climate debate, will look back at the history of the real world and say, look, there is no correlation between CO2 and temperature. It's just not there in the real world. The only place where it is in the computer models. And of course, that's because they program them to rise temperature when CO2 rises. But as I'm sure Dr. Ball explained, that's not happening in the real world.